Hello, this is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. Now, today we're going to talk about morality, or maybe even just as much immorality. Oftentimes it's hard to see how we may be being immoral to other people. And oftentimes we only are able to see how they're being immoral to us. Now, the result of that is partly the problem that we're having today inside of our political system. Everyone has kind of made the decision that they're the one that's being wronged. But morality is such a fascinating subject, and it's one that we want to talk about. We're going to tie it into our recent visit to Bosnia. Many of you know about the Bosnian genocide. Bosnian genocide was a horrific event that really begins to help portray how some of these issues come to play. Now, again, our whole goal is to try and help rekindle the American spirit. We hope that if you like what it is that we're talking about, maybe you'll go to theoptimisticamerican.com/premium, become one of our premium members. If not, just subscribe. Push the subscribe button. Cost you nothing, has no other effect other than making certain that you're getting part of our content. And we always appreciate your comments. Your comments matter to us, even the negative ones. We read all of them. So again, I'm here with Dr. Emily Bashah as we wind up this season. Dr. Bashah, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, so the whole idea of morality, I mean, to me, there are some things of morality that are a mystery. One of them is that there are all these universal morals that seem to exist, some things that are kind of basic that all of us are offended by, almost regardless of what civilization that we live in. And I don't know that we're going to be able to help people understand where that comes from, but in itself, it is fascinating to think about and to understand. I do believe a big part of that's driven by the whole focus of an individualistic society. When we say that the individual is primary, when we say that the individual is at the top of the pyramid, that also means that we have some moral obligations to other individuals. I think collective societies, especially authoritarian societies, care less about that. But nonetheless, we certainly have seen some challenges to the issue of morality. One of the things that I want to talk about today is how our social status oftentimes can come in conflict with morality.
Yes, absolutely. We just came back from Bosnia and had a remarkable trip and tour of Sarajevo and other parts of the outskirts of the country. Dr. Asad Bushkailo, he's a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book about healing from the trauma. And he was a concentration camp survivor for more than a year. And he talks about, almost like these absurdities of this ethnic-based war. And he said one day he was driving out of his town. He lives in the outskirts of Sarajevo. And there were some masked men with machine guns that were standing in the street, and they stopped his car. At the time, he was working as a first aid medic for people on the front line. And one of the men who were masked said, turn back or we'll kill you. And Assad said, no. I'm a medic, and, people are fighting a war and they need me to help them. And the man, almost pleaded with him, the one who was wearing the mask with the gun, and pulled up his mask and said, Assad, I know you need to turn back. They're going to kill you if you proceed. And it turns out it was somebody he knew from his community. And these were people, whether you were a Muslim Bosniak or a Christian Serb or Croatian, these were people who lived in the same communities. The differences and the divisions are really hard to see as an outsider, and they grew up together. And so the fact that this person was on the other side and begging and pleading with him not to be killed, it's surprising, and yet he pressed on.
Yeah, it's probably worthwhile to tell just a little bit of the history for people who don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Sarajevo was a beautiful city, and it's been deeply involved in a lot of modern day history, certainly in the 20th century. The 20th century in Sarajevo, there was an archduke called Francis Ferdinand. He was assassinated on the streets of Sarajevo by a Serbian assassin. Now, the car is actually there. You and I went up and looked at the car, and you could see the place where the assassin was standing. But that caused World War I, literally because of this thing called realpolitik, which was basically a set of alliances that were set up around the world. The world began to break up into sides. And before we were done, tens of millions of people died in that war. It was well, there was nothing like it up until that point. Some people say there was a single shot that ended up causing the death of 30 million people. Later, what happened was, after World War II, there was a guy named Tito who was a war hero. He was also a communist, but he fought in the war, was very, very brave in World War II, and he decided that he liked the Americans better than he liked the Soviets, and he built an alliance with us. His country was called Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia had a variety of different countries in it: Macedonia, Croatia, Serbia, as well as Bosnia. Now, Bosnia was much more multi-ethnic. It had inside of it Bosniaks, which were Muslims. It had Serbians, Croatians, and others. Where in Serbia, most of the people in Serbia were actually Serbians. Well, when Tito died, the Soviets saw it as a way to be able to gain back this area as part of their sphere. So they began sending military equipment to the Serbians. The Serbians, for a wide variety of different reasons, most of which related to things that had happened 500 years before with the Ottoman Empire, began to see the Bosniaks as being the problem. But really what it was a land grab. They wanted to get Bosnia into Serbia. And the way to do that, it wasn't all that complex. You wanted to be able to justify that by saying, hey, we had a public vote. Now, here's an easy way to get the public vote. You go in and you assassinate or kill all the Muslims, so the people that are left are mostly Serbian. Literally, in the very first town that they went into, the general, you can watch him on a YouTube clip where he tells the city leaders to bring all the Muslims into the town square. Most of the men come. He says, look, you mean nothing to me. I'll kill all of you right where you stand, or you'll get on those buses and we're going to relocate you. Well, they did, only didn't relocate them. He drove them out a few miles to a place where they had built big, huge open trenches, and they killed them and buried them in these mass graves. Well, if you can get rid of the 40% of the people who were Muslim in that town, again, the only people left to vote are the people who might be much more pro-Serbian. And they began to do that in town after town. Well, the problem for them was sooner or later a couple of people escaped, and as they began to warn the other Bosniaks, the Bosniaks knew there was no reason to get on the bus, much less go to even the town square, and they moved to the hills to try to fight back. When they fought back, they were fighting against cannons and bazookas and people with heavy armament, literally with handguns and clubs and rifles. And there are incredible stories of heroism. They were able to hold off this army for, I think it was about 3 years before the Americans actually entered into the war. The fascinating thing about that is to watch the breakdown of morality that happened certainly on the Serbian side. The city of Sarajevo is a city that's sitting down at the bottom of a valley, and it's surrounded very tightly by a set of mountains. The Serbians began to occupy those mountains, and there were stories that where there were about things. There's actually a special you can watch on this called the Sarajevo Safari, I believe it's called, where Russians would pay the Serbians to go into the mountains. Hunters would pay the Serbians to go into the mountains, and they would then take high-scope rifles and then wait for somebody to cross one of the streets inside the city, and they'd pick them off. And they paid so much for a baby and so much for a woman, so much for an older person. As it turns out, we got involved. General Wesley Clark, who's been on this show before, was the Supreme Allied Commander of the NATO forces. Bill Clinton authorized the bombing, and after we entered, it didn't take very long before the Serbians surrendered and the war was over, and then we had to reach a peace that we were able to pull together in Ohio. Anyway, long story short, they're still dealing with those hard feelings. Right? They're still dealing with people who went through those horrific experiences and that have a hard time forgetting or letting go.
Yeah, one thing, on the other side of morality, it can be easy, I think, cognitively to separate good versus evil. But when you get in conflict with your values and somehow good versus evil is somewhat skewed or very big gray area, it can be hard in those times to make some decisions. What is the best thing to do? What is morality in this situation? I think one example that comes up for me right now as I'm talking about this, Dr. Brishkailo described to us while we were there. He was, serving as a medic, but often, for the Bosniaks. And so that's why he was also imprisoned in that concentration camp, because he was helping the other side.
Yeah, prison to a concentration camp, yeah.
But at one point, he had a patient who was Serbian, who was a casualty of the war. And he guarded that body. And the Bosniaks wanted to interrogate him. He was a soldier for the Serbian army. And he stood over that body and said no, and defended him and said, he's my patient, hands off. And sure enough, he revived him back to life.
So let's talk about this topic for a second. It's the idea that all of us come in conflict between our social setting and our morality or our values. Psychologically, what's the term for that?
So cognitive dissonance is really that tension and conflict that exists between our values and what we do in our behavior. And when that tension exists, we have to find some tension-reducing strategies. That's when we get into some problems, because that's when we have some kind of nihilistic views, or we have to find some simple ways of seeing that good versus evil.
Nihilism meaning there is no universal truth.
Yes. Yeah. And so in order to categorize, all Serbs are evil, is one way of doing that and reducing that cognitive dissonance. And so why should I save that body, even though he's dying? This is a person who is oppressed by people, and he should die.
So, but this isn't just soldiers. This can affect anyone, correct?
Well, it can justify wars. It can justify killing innocent children and women.
I get
and
that, but I want to take this back even before that. I mean, this can be peer pressure amongst young girls outing another girl. Same concept, right?
Yeah, you're dehumanizing and objectifying another person, and therefore you don't feel any remorse or compassion or guilt for hurting them.
So it's very human. The idea that you want to fit into a group, and there's a clique. That's what they used to call them when I was in school. I don't know if that's still the term, but there were cliques. And if you wanted to fit into that clique, there was always some kind of leader of the clique. And sometimes the leader of the clique might decide that somebody's out, or somebody deserves to be made fun of, or somebody deserves, somebody's a lesser than. And so if you want to fit in socially, then it's important to kind of accept that harassment of the other person or that alienation of the other person.
That's right. And there's probably multiple things going on, like fear of ridicule if I don't just go along with what the group is doing, fear of being ousted myself if I stand up for that person that is being pushed out of the group. But I'm drawn because of my sense of wanting to belong to this group identity, that I'm just going to allow myself to, maybe I'm not going to hurt that person physically, but maybe I'll just be the silent observer, the one who doesn't do or say anything, even though it's going against my moral values, because it's more important to me that I fit in.
Right. And again, the reason I like using the peers is I think all of us can connect to that happening in grade school, maybe even high school, and we might have been somebody in the clique, or we might have been somebody on the outside of the clique. I tended to be the person on the outside of the clique. But nonetheless, that doesn't end there, right? I left being the CEO of our healthcare company, Redirect Health, and I'm now the president of the company. But I've hung out with lots of people who have started companies, created companies, entrepreneurs, CEOs. Believe me, there's a clique. There's a group of people that have a certain mindset, and they have certain complaints. And it's oftentimes, even though I might listen to them and disagree with them, there's a pressure not to speak up, not to say, well, I kind of see it maybe differently, or to make certain that other people's point of view are included. It doesn't matter what group you're in. All of us have those pressures. All of us want to fit into some type of social establishment. Would you agree?
Yeah, and there's so much social psychology and research that looks at this, and I think the biggest thing is we are social creatures, and we are primed to have this sense of belonging for this community, and it somehow is this protective factor. If people were isolated and confronted with some challenges of doing the right thing, most people would do the right thing if they were by themselves rather than in a group, because there's this de-individuation that happens. Like, no one's singling me out, no one's judging me, but if it was just me and this one person and no one else was around, most people would step in to do the right thing.
Yeah, when we met with the mayor of Sarajevo, I remember talking about the idea of forgiveness, which is one of our big themes, and you kind of caught that wasn't something she was quite buying into.
Yeah, she's confronted with trying to piece together some kind of semblance of political organization so that they could work with the Croatians and Serbians in this kind of broken political system. And, she's looking at us saying, like, what do you guys have to complain about? You've got Republicans and Democrats. What's going on?
Yeah,
over
she
there?
tagged me. She said, "Oh, come on.
We have a more serious
You can't even get Republicans and Democrats to agree." She says, "You bet you people have no good reason to be in disagreement with one another. You have everything." And that's the view from the outside. It ought to be the view from the inside. We do. We have so much to be grateful for, and instead we squabble about the most silly things.
Exactly.
But it's part of that fitting in socially. And it's, I look at what happened to them. They're trying to reconcile that. They're trying to come to this point where they can find peace amongst themselves, because they still have Serbians, Croatians, and Muslims all living in the same city. It's the same country. It is a very, very, it is not what you would expect. I mean, this is not a place of burqas and Arabs and people speaking Arabic. This is a place, and by the way, I've loved those places that we visited, so that's not a derogatory statement about them, but it's a very European city, right? And you don't really know when you walk down the street who is what. There's
so much diversity.
There's so much diversity, but they look a lot alike. They probably look more alike than we look alike in the United States, just kind of making my read of it. And yet they have these divisions because of their nationality. Nationalism became the big, huge cry, and it created a massive divide. And that divide ended up being something that became very ugly. Patching it up now, I mean, we talked to them about, they were talking about the murals in City Hall, and we said, well, maybe you ought to point out some of the Serbian or the Croatian heroes that were in the war to the people of Bosnia. With the logic being, Schindler's List. It's not lost on me that the Jewish community has made Schindler a real hero. Well, Schindler was a Nazi. He was just a Nazi, and he was profiting off of the war. But he was a hero because he saved people. Because even though he was flawed and did some things wrong, he, at the end of the day, was a humanist, and he took the right side, and he tried to make certain that people were protected. And in the end, making him a hero says to other people, hey, this isn't about being German or some other country in Europe or Jewish. This is about your view of life. And I do think that oftentimes we see that in these places that we go to. When I was in Cambodia, it was clear to me that the urban area thought that it was a rural issue. Well, in Germany, oftentimes the Jews think that it was Germans. And in Rwanda, it was all Hutus or all Tutsis felt that it was the Hutus. And here it was, a belief that maybe it was Christians because it was Muslims being persecuted by them. At the end, that's a very human condition. People being willing to do extreme things. And then a big, big chunk of people being caught in that cognitive dissonance role where they're having to make this decision between, well, what's right and how do I fit in?
Yeah, and I think, there were so many people that I spoke to who have survived such, atrocious tragedies and trauma and losses, and yet they still talked about hope and wanting to piece together some kind of unity among these various ethnic groups. And even the mayor herself, Benyamina, she's amazing. She discussed, her family is comprised of Jews, Serbians, and Bosniaks.
Yeah, that was
They're
fascinating.
in her bloodline, all three of them. And so, trying to explain the conflict here in America, it's really hard because they think, well, no, you're either Serbian or Croatian or Bosniak. You're not one. But if you have the same bloodline of all three, that it coexists.
What I loved about her, I found her to be fascinating, very upbeat. I mean, she lived through this. As a child, she lived through this.
And she has pain.
And there were things that happened that she saw that children should never have to see. But she is positive, optimistic. She definitely doesn't fit into the political crowd because even on issues, she tries to spend time talking about more human issues and finding common ground. In my opinion, Sarajevo, by the way, I would highly recommend to anybody to go visit. It is a great city to see, and it has incredible historic benefit. It's beautiful. It's a good place to stay. It's also very affordable. It's one of the more affordable trips that we've done.
Very safe.
The mayor, though, I just was impressed as a great representative of the people.
I agree.
Yeah. So
powerful history.
So I think the last thing that's important to me is all I could think about when I was there, because of the role that the Russians played, was the Russian Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, obviously, he ended up going. He served for the Communist Party in the military. He ended up being sent to the German front. He was made a prisoner of war there, spent years there being brutalized and tortured, then came back, and Stalin put him into a gulag. And he wrote the book, which later dramatically changed the world, called The Gulag Archipelago. But what was the most fascinating to me about his book was that he talked about this conflict that existed and why many people in the Gulag thought that they should be angry at Stalin. And of course they should have been. I mean, Stalin, what he did to them was inhuman and it was wrong. He also saw that he could have blamed Hitler. He made the decision not to blame either one of them. He said instead he wanted to look at his own accountability. And so he looked at it, and he tells this story in the book about, as a captain, I think he was a captain, he was sent out to remove these kulaks from their farms. Now, kulaks were kulaks because they had one cow, which made them a rich farmer, and their job was to take away property ownership because property ownership was evil. But what it was really about was they needed to get these kulaks off of their farms because they were very productive farms, and then move poor farmers onto them and utilize the excess money as a way to fund the party and the industrial development that they were trying to do to become a better communist nation. Only problem is when you take people off their land, when you take away their property, usually they won't shut up. And they didn't shut up. So his job became to relocate them. He said that he relocated 10,000 families, which ended up being over 60,000 people that all died. He said they all died that winter. He recruited them to Siberia with nothing, without the right clothing, without the right shelters, and they all died. He argues, it's a decent argument today, that probably somewhere around 20 million people died in the gulags. There are some people who think that it maybe was 7 or 8 million, but everybody admits we don't know. It's somewhere between those two numbers. We don't know because they didn't care. There's no reason to keep track of the people that were dying there. But what Alexander told us, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, was that each of us have good and evil inside of us, and that what ideology does is it allows us to transport that evil over to a group, because ideologies, he said, sees people based upon the group that they're in. He was a communist, so he was good. Kulaks were property owners, so they were evil. And so it was okay for him to relocate them. And his answer was, he knew that it wasn't. But that whole idea of this cognitive dissonance came into play. He didn't want to give up his standing. He didn't want to give up his position and his rank. And he said, that's not Stalin's fault. That's my fault. We all play a role in this, all of us. And the morality that we should have, that we should start with, is the idea that, how do we treat other people? Are we going to be kind to them? Are we going to listen to them? Are we going to try to be empathetic to their concerns? Are we going to be big enough to recognize that maybe sometimes we're the one that has to listen more while they talk more, even though we are going crazy about the things that maybe they're saying? And if we do that, we know that we can create a better place. Look, I say this over and over again. If you want to be patriotic, how about you just quit insulting other Americans? Start with that. That's not that complex. That's a moral. That's a value. That's something that says, I can be kind to other people, even when maybe they're not being kind to me.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think one other reframe that I can give people, especially when they feel like their personal values are being threatened, is maintain your agency and maintain your power and control over yourself. Be responsible for yourself. If you get into this defensive stance because you want to defend your beliefs or you want to defend your values, you're allowing yourself to give up on your own personal power. So if you think about it that way, it can help you see it's not weak to not fight. It's about picking which battles are worthy and important. And it doesn't mean that you have to win every single argument. And sometimes to be the better person is about maintaining your power rather than giving it up away so easily and showing that insecurity and weakness and ego fragility.
Yeah, I think these common moral issues that I think are in most people, we know that we're supposed to be kind to other people. We know that we're not supposed to insult them. We know that when we go on Twitter and somebody makes a negative comment and we shoot back with something else that's negative, we know we're not going to make it any better. We know we're probably going to make it worse. We just don't care. We don't care because at the end of the day, we're more concerned about us and our opinion. There's an immorality to that all on its own, and we know it. We know it intuitively that it's not the right thing to do. We make excuses for why it's right. I mean, I'm listening to people constantly now telling me, well, if they were a supporter of his, then they must not be an American. Oh, come on. There are a lot of different reasons why people support different candidates, or people who are taking positions that say, that this is really about the liberals wanting to overthrow our country or taking away the values that we care about. Not only are those gross exaggerations, they just simply aren't recognizing the ability on how to be kind to other people. We can do better. And I would tell you the place to start is by trusting your own morality as opposed to trusting your ego.
Yeah, and sometimes it calls for, a fall cleaning, a cleansing, as we say, akin to the time of Yom Kippur, really engaging in that self-reflection and forgiving those who have hurt you. But sometimes even self-forgiveness is the hardest part of it.
Yep, well, we'll do another show on forgiveness. All right, Dr. Bashah, thanks again for being here. I'd like to thank all of our guests. Thanks for being a part of the Optimistic American. We really do appreciate you being here. Always, if you can, sign up for the Optimistic American /optimisticamerican.com/premium. Or if nothing else, become a subscriber. That in itself really helps us. And last, leave those comments. Let us know how you see this. Thanks again. Appreciate your being here. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.